Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And this is Kirsty Buchanan, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Good morning, good morning, good morning.
Yes, love that. And this is Joe Tanner, political strategist. Hello, Joe.
Hello to everyone, whatever time of day you're listening.
Very good.
I'm going to do my midnight caller voice, in case it's late at night.
It's a bit early for the sexy tones, Joe, isn't it?
But, someone might be listening to this to drift off to sleep, and you've just woken them up, Kirsty. I feel like I need to take them back down, just
That's
in
what we're here
case.
for. That's what we're here for.
What can I tell you? I've had 7 hours and 42 minutes of sleep.
Oh,
And
well
according
done
to
you.
my Fitbit, so there you go.
Well, that's very good. Well, I was at dear friend and colleague Chloe Tilley's for dinner last night, which was extremely lovely, but has resulted in not getting really as much sleep as, a boy of my age requires. But here we are.
Have you got a bit of a sore head?
No,
Was
it's
alcohol
actually fine.
consumed?
It's more the tiredness. It's more the tiredness that's a problem. But I'll tell you what, the steak was lovely. So thank you very much for that, Chloe
Oh, well
and
done,
family. Right, on the podcast today, inflation is up. Are we heading for a cost of living crisis again? And what does this mean for Rachel Reeves's budget of doom, potentially, that's coming in a few months' time? We'll, of course,
give it its official title.
Yeah, I think that's what it'll say on the red box. And
Run!
we'll also be reviewing Sir Keir Starmer's very quick trip to the White House, along with, 6 of his colleagues and President Zelensky, to meet with President Trump. What have we learned? What has changed? Is peace closer today than it was last week? Also, the Migrant Hotel Policy. It looks like it might be heading for something resembling collapse. We'll discuss that as well. You can have your say, of course. We love to get your messages. You can email us, hello@whitehallsources.com, or you can WhatsApp us. The number is 0333 404 07. Right, Kirsty and Joe, should we dive in on inflation, I think, first of all? New figures this morning. Inflation jumping to the highest level in a year and a half. The Times writes it as propelled by rising food, hotel and flight prices, and they say, underscoring the economic difficulties building up for Chancellor Rachel Reeves ahead of the autumn budget. Kirsty, this is the problem, isn't it? There's been a whole long line of economic data and issues and problems and conundrums that Rachel Reeves has got to address come the budget. How would you evaluate the position she is in based on this latest data?
Same as I would have last week. Up a creek without a paddle.
The water
Look.
just got deeper. Is that what we're saying?
Without a paddle and not much of a boat left at this race either. I mean, it's interesting what's fueling the rise in inflation. Yes, some of it's airfares and the obligatory seasonal screwing of the consumer as they try to escape miserable Britain to lighten their lives with a couple of weeks in Marbella. But a lot of it is actually driven by energy prices, petrol prices and groceries, which raises the spectre that we may be moving back into a kind of cost of living crisis again. I mean, we're not going to get anywhere near the kind of 11% that we got in the fallout from COVID. But nevertheless, I think we're looking at inflation predicting to continue to rise to up to 4% by the autumn. That matters particularly from Rachel Reeves' point of view in September, because September is the month in which the Treasury has to set the annual uptick for benefits and pensions, both of which are inflation linked, both of which are absolutely huge bills already, and both of which will probably necessitate more borrowing. And what this inflation figure has overshadowed is actually also an increase in the 10-year gilts, the cost of borrowing, the government's cost of borrowing as well. So that black hole, which was estimated by a very respected think tank last week to be in a region of about 50 billion. I mean, of course, the Treasury say that they don't recognise that figure, but in the words of Manny Rice Davis, they would, wouldn't they? Only seems to be getting bigger. And the fact that the gilt markets are showing signs of nerves is something that is very worrying for us. We're not, immediately at kind of truss post-trust budget levels, but we're not far off it. And the cost of borrowing is just increasingly becoming the biggest headache for the government.
I think that's right. We'll come back to that because I want to pick up on the cost of living point, which is a good one. And Joe, some people listening to this will think, are we heading for another cost of living crisis? Hang on a second. Did we ever get out of the last one, which is kind of largely considered to be 2022, 2023? But reality is that people will probably still be feeling quite a bit worse off compared to a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it doesn't feel like the scales have really balanced yet for a lot of people. I think the feeling that things are more expensive and the feeling that people perhaps have just managed to make it to the summer. And then, particularly if you're what is it, the term we use, working family, it is often that group of people that find the summer incredibly challenging. If you're lucky enough to be able to afford a summer holiday, great. But just managing the school holidays when you've got kids at home and eating more and, wanting to go to this place and that place, it's incredibly expensive. So you will have already been feeling that. And then you're getting that series of stories looking ahead to the budget, which are just telling you that everything that's coming is pretty bleak. There's even been some warnings about energy prices now, I think, that came out yesterday. So there is a sense that, what's the point of everything? Where is this headed? What value is there what value is in their saving? Because my savings go nowhere. If I own a house, I'm now potentially going to be taxed heavily on that. My council tax is probably going to be changing if I'm in an area where they've managed to balance the books quite well. Well, so what? Your council tax is out compared to everybody else, is the line you're hearing. And also, despite the promise that, on working people, taxes won't be increased, it looks inevitable that they're going to come in some way. So it's all just pretty bleak. And I think you're right. I don't think anyone felt there'd been a benefit or an uptick anyway from last year. And it now just feels like it's all about to get worse again anyway. So it doesn't feel like a particularly good time. I can't imagine anyone out there sort of making grand plans to, if anything, they might be looking to downsize rather than buy something bigger. If you've got a family that you're expanding, you're probably going to be really worrying about what your outlook's going to look like, just because of where's the money going to come from. You're probably not going to see a significant uptick in your wages. You're not going to see your living standards improve. You're probably just going to see more and more money going out the door.
Mm. And this is why rising inflation really matters, because on top of national insurance contributions for employers depressing growth, depressing business investment, what rising inflation does is it depresses consumer spending. People are worried. They're uncertain about the future. Everything they read about the economic outlook is bleak to horrific, depending on what newspaper or online article you want to read at any given point. And so what you batten down the hatches, you stop spending what money you've got in terms of savings you hold on to. And, and it would just getting caught in this death spiral. People aren't investing in the economy. Businesses aren't investing in the economy. And, down the plug hole we go. This is getting increasingly depressing.
It is a bit, but let's continue with the analysis, because it's important to put it to add information to all of this. And actually, I've just been looking up Fraser Nelson's brilliant essay from a couple of weeks ago in the Times, which is on the point of the cost of government borrowing, Kirsty, that you were making. And actually, I just want to read a little bit of it because I think it's really informative. Okay, so during the pandemic, all countries borrowed, says Fraser Nelson, but most had done so locking in low rates for 10 or more years, come what may. They paid a bit more for the certainty, but they did so anyway. If inflation came back, they'd be protected. Britain gambled on that never happening. About a quarter of our national debt was linked to inflation. So if rates rose, taxpayers would be hugely on the hook. No major country had even half as much exposure. It was a bomb, primed to explode under British public finances.
This is me and my mortgage. Well, this is me and my mortgage. This is exactly the conversation that I remember having with my financial advisor about my mortgage a few years ago, where he said, rates are going to keep coming down, Joe. And I said, I'm not being funny, but 1.5% is pretty good going, when my first mortgage, I think, was 7.75 when I was in my 20s.
Right.
And I said to him at that point, well, even if it goes down another 0.25% or 0.5%, 1.5% is a pretty good place to sit. I can live with that. So I did. And in those 5 years, at the beginning, I think there started to be a bit of a drop. And then, of course, there was all the chaos with Liz Truss. And then as I was going to renew my 5-year fixed deal recently, rates were sitting at just under 4%. Now, I was overpaying on my mortgage thinking, well, if they changed at some point, I'll actually I won't feel the stretch as much. The bank have seen I can afford to overpay slightly because I've been really sensible. But it means I haven't felt that jump back up to nearly 4%. Now I've signed another 5-year deal. But question was, is it worth locking in for 5 years? I decided it was because I don't like that. So it is, that is exactly what people make decisions on day to day. Do I want the certainty for a few years, but overall, is it going to balance out, or am I going to miss out a little bit here or there? It's exactly the conversation that households will be having up and down the country. And it doesn't sound, I think, from what Fraser said, Fraser wrote, and I think if that is the case, it doesn't sound like the government really thought through the strategy, particularly given global uncertainty. Surely you'd have been looking ahead and thinking there are some significant challenges still ahead, that therefore it's choppy waters potentially.
And to be fair to Rachel Reeves, this didn't happen on her watch.
Sure.
This happened under a Conservative government. I can remember talking to a Treasury spad for Rishi Sunak once he had taken over, and it was in the aftermath of them having taken over and having had a look at the books. And this was the single biggest concern that they had, was the amount of inflation-linked borrowing that the government was on the hook for. And even, what we're talking now, 3 or 4 years ago, and they were saying, this is exactly to this point, this is, a bomb waiting to explode under the British economy. And I did the same thing, Joe, but when I did it, and I think I've probably told the pod this before, so apologies if you've heard this one before and I sound like, old grandpa has had too many beers at a party. But, when Liz Truss looked increasingly likely to become the Prime Minister, and I had listened to or read an article from her economic guru about the state of the economy, and he had said interest rates have been too low for too long. We need a course correction. And if it means a rise in mortgage rates, then good was the word he used. I went straight out the next day, got in contact with my mortgage broker and said, get me the best deal you can get for the longest amount of time you can. I checked on it the other day because I thought surely this must be coming to an end soon. So I was going to be braced for what happens afterwards. And that's years after Liz Truss's budget, and it's still going to have an impact on me when that rate comes to an end next year. So, yes, it has real world consequences. Yes, this is of the Conservative government's own making, but none of that excuses some of the huge missteps that Rachel Reeves has made in terms of, she wanted an economy where growth was the solution to the economic inheritance that she received. And again, I cannot fathom for a second, if growth is the solution to digging you out of the £22 billion black hole that you said you inherited, then why on green earth did you add extra costs to British businesses? It was, and will always be an insanity from which this government probably will never dig itself out from underneath.
Does it make you think, though, about the conversations that go on? I've always thought that, when people said, oh, Rishi Sunak, he's got so much money, he's out of touch or whatever, I think was some of the sort of phrases that we used. And I always used to think, well, he's not corruptible. Like he's got enough money that he's not gonna need a bung or to be in sort of not going to need to be in hock to somebody. But actually, if you haven't had to make those kind of decisions, Kirsty, that we're talking about, do you think it changes your perception?
No. In fairness to Rishi Sunak, like I say, I had a conversation with a policy spad under Rishi Sunak's government in the Treasury, who, their entire purpose and concern was about the impact that this would have on working families, on average, normal, hardworking, Middle England people. And one of the reasons, if you go back to that endless debate that we had about the sequential nature of growth over the Conservative leadership contest between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss thought that you could tax cut your way to growth.
Yeah.
And Rishi Sunak said, no, you have to squeeze inflation out first, then growth comes, and then you can cut taxes. And the reason that he did that was because he understands probably better than most people the impact that inflation has on normal businesses, on normal families, on workers in Britain. And it's, it comes back to the Thatcher quote, I think way back in 1981, when she said something along the lines of inflation is the destroyer of all. It is the destroyer of livelihoods. It is the destroyer of communities. It is the destroyer of business. You've got to squeeze that out before your country can grow. This is why inflation is so damaging. And to be fair to Rishi Sunak, he was extremely alive to that.
But who committed the UK to that vulnerability?
Well, Boris was our big borrower, wasn't he?
Yeah, but who was signing off for him though? Who was in charge at the Treasury committing to that? Because you're saying on the one hand Rishi was concerned, but wasn't Rishi in the job?
Yeah, he was, but ultimately, number 10 has sway, right? The Treasury's job, like everything else in life, is to advise, and ultimately, the buck stops with the Prime Minister. Yeah. So, a Treasury, I've sat around numerous cabinet meetings where the Chancellor will say we can't do that because of this, what, that, and everybody rolls their eyes. Some of that doesn't stop it being true. That is part of a Treasury's pushback. What I can't understand is how the Treasury itself got itself into a position under Rachel Reeves where the entire express purpose of this government was to grow its way out of a dilemma that the Conservatives had left the country in, and yet then did the one thing that was going to make it least likely to happen, which was to put extra tax burdens on business. It's just unfathomable to me.
That is, in a way, part of the reform argument is that you've got nobody that's really run a business or has business experience that then is making big
you don't need to have run a business. You need to have a halfpenny's worth of common sense, right? Literally.
No, I agree. I agree with you. I'm just saying that's where often the argument comes back to, though, is who in do Labour really understand business? The view was that all those smoked salmon breakfasts were really informative and helped them position themselves really well ahead of the election. But did they really, or was it just that they were saying stuff? Were they repeating back things they'd been told rather than actually understanding the fundamentals of what was going to tip the scales of business in terms of future decisions?
And politically, here's an interesting one as we go into the budget and move. Whatever happens in the budget's going to be bad. It's probably going to revolve around a lot of extra taxes for a lot of people. We've still got, again, unfathomably, the workers' rights bill coming down the pipe, which will add more cost to businesses and more burdens to businesses. And then off the back of that, we've got a set of elections next year. Scotland, Wales, a lot of local authority elections, some of the shires that didn't happen this year, and a lot of urban kind of city metropolitan boroughs. Off the back of that, what you're increasingly starting to see popping up in my algorithmically divided Britain push on X is the same things about the cost of net zero. So it will become, for me so far, this is the wedge issue that hasn't really kind of set fire, but I suspect it will as we come out the back of this budget. We are spending as a government £23 billion on carbon capture. A not entirely proven, method of reducing carbon emissions. 23 billion. Yeah. We're spending another 15 billion on various other investments for net zero. This, I think, will become, as we move towards the next election, one of those big wedge issues. You say we've got no money. You've taxed us all to the eyeballs. Why are we spending billions and billions of pounds when our emissions in terms of global emissions are 1%, et cetera, et cetera? It's an absolute open goal for reform.
Let's go on. We want to discuss some of the other issues around this week as well. We'll continue to reflect on budget build-up because there are lots of kites flying. The sky is full of them. You can't move for kites. And if you follow the little strings off the kites, they're all in Rachel Reeves' hand. So we'll see what happens in the build-up to the budget. But we want to go on to discuss the aftermath of the summit in Alaska between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, to meetings in the White House with President Zelensky of Ukraine and 7 European leaders, including Sir Keir Starmer. The pace of developments in the last, or at least the pace of gatherings in the last few days has been really quite intense. These Alaska talks last Friday, the first direct engagement between the US and Russia under Trump's presidency. It drew criticism, it drew scrutiny. Did it make any progress towards peace? Then, just a few days after that, President Zelensky and several European leaders landed in Washington to try to display something resembling unity from Europe when it comes to the way forward here towards peace. So, how are these events shaping progress? What may lie ahead? Jill, shall we start with the spectacle of these leaders all descending on the White House on Monday? It was quite something to see.
Yeah, it was. And I think for all the criticism of Trump, I think you have to kind of hand it to him that he managed to create an event for a conversation to happen. And I think actually as a team, I think they'll be pretty pleased with the fact that they managed to create this sort of piece of theatre. And we saw everyone was relatively well behaved, probably apart from Trump going off on his random ramblings about the state of Washington, D.C. and people telling him that they knew people that were going out for dinner in Washington for the first time because it's so much safer since he took over and made his decisions about how to police the area. So I think the fundamentals, it was interesting that he had this big grand sort of pronouncement about what was happening. And then he obviously started to, there was a change in the way that he's approaching stuff because the narrative started to change a bit. It went to becoming a listening exercise, didn't it? And it was sort of, we may get this, we'll talk about this later, there was, to some extent, for Trump's big pronouncements, it all got sort of dialed back, I think, as the reality of the challenge ahead was becoming very clear. The really big thing for me, though, was sort of Zelensky and how Zelensky played it. I felt sort of a bit disappointed that he did change his clothes and arrived wearing something different because I kind of wanted him to just stick to his guns, but I liked
Although that did give him license to absolutely cook the reporter who'd given him a hard time last time.
He went for Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend, didn't he?
Yeah.
In quite a good way about, I've changed my suit, you haven't, which I thought was very good. And even actually sort of Trump then sort of made a point of saying it wasn't me that was horrible to you, it was him, which was, I thought was quite funny because it did sort of give you a sense that the criticism of how Trump had played it had obviously it had got through to Trump, it felt to me. It felt like there was a slight change in his approach. But more than anything, I thought what was really telling was that we've seen this narrative has established that Trump was very much on sort of almost on Putin's side and that the scales are very much balanced for Putin. And what I thought was interesting was what backfired slightly was the letter from Melania to Putin, which then when Zelensky turned up and provided a letter from his wife, the First Lady of Ukraine, he specifically said it wasn't for Trump, which was quite a nice little jibe, which will have stung a little bit, but was done quite sensitively. But it also prompted a journalist to say, does this mean that there is a change from the White House in the sense that there is no letter from Melania urging Zelensky to end the killing of these poor children? It was very much that was in Putin's gift to do something about, and it wasn't Zelensky's. And I thought it was interesting that Trump didn't quite rise to it, but it was sort of pointedly made in his living room, as it were, in the Oval Office, that there was perhaps a slight difference in approach towards the two countries. So it was a spectacle. I was actually really pleased to see it. I think there's a lot of, I'm not a fan of Trump's, but you can't deny that he has managed to move things along. Whether it gets to a successful outcome, who knows?
That's
but
right.
It's things which has to be progress in some respect.
And I think that's a fair take, isn't it, Kirsty? That actually, even if there is the spectacle of progress, does that count as progress in and of itself, if you see what I mean? Is that helpful?
I think it depends where you set your timer from.
Right.
So I think if you set your timer from that disastrous, appalling bullying of Zelensky in the Oval Office in February, clearly, I think the reaction to that, the backlash that we saw from the European leaders on that, has had some impact on Trump. He does not like being seen in that light, and he wants to be seen as someone who is more even-handed in his dealings. I agree with Joe, it's like the biggest box office draw since Barnum rolled into town with his circus, right? I mean, who thought politics would be so entertaining? And I just as a mild segue, Georgia Maloney
Oh, yeah.
rolling her eyes and flicking her hair and going, I don't have time for this kind of attitude exuding from her when Keir Starmer went on and on and on about just and lasting peace, I thought was just a treat. But if you set your timer at 2 weeks ago, I think what Alaska and the Washington meeting ultimately ended up as is performative progress rather than, frankly, real progress. 2 weeks ago, we had a US president who had clearly lost patience with Putin, was threatening secondary sanctions on countries that were still dealing with Russia in a significant way, like India, and had gone into that. And that had prompted Putin to pick up the phone. The threat of really tough economic sanctions that's what made Putin pick up the phone. And when we went into the Alaska meeting, you'll remember Putin was saying a ceasefire was a prerequisite for progress. And if there wasn't a ceasefire and Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire, he wouldn't be happy and there would be serious consequences. But the meeting in Alaska happened even as Russia was sending more drones to drop more bombs on, Ukrainian men, women and children. And yet we don't have either a ceasefire. Trump has moved completely away from a ceasefire being a prerequisite for peace. And the conversation about sanctions and secondary sanctions has completely disappeared. What we do have is a vague promise of American security backstop, which again, if you take your benchmark as February, that is progress, vague as it may be, because in February he was giving no such guarantees. He was simply saying the fact that there are American companies on the ground is security enough. He said something slightly more than that, and I think that is significant. And I think we're beginning to see, rightly or wrongly, a kind of grudging acceptance that a frozen conflict is probably the most likely outcome, and that will mean there is some loss of land. It's not a land for transfer. It's not a recognition of new borders. It's simply a kind of frozen North Korea, South Korea. The coalition of the willing, as far as I can work out, hasn't moved forward from February at all. It's still the coalition of the willing, but frankly, they're not very able. Whether Putin would accept it or not, I've yet to see any shaping of what that would look like in real terms. We don't have the boots on the ground to do this. And nobody else seems to want to commit kind of boots on the ground either. And meanwhile, against all of that, the person that hasn't shifted at all is Putin. Yeah. No ceasefire, no handback of land taken, a constant demand Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO, and an utter refusal to accept European American boots on the ground. Hasn't moved at all, not a jot.
I think he has in that. The one thing that did happen, Kirsty, which you said, was that he picked up the phone. And so while
he picked up the phone because of a threat of sanctions. He stands up to deterrence. He does not stand up to acquiescence and flattery. Doesn't care about it.
That's why I wonder, though, if that is the Trump card. In that, does Trump need to put boots on the ground, or does he need to have that threat to sit there? And if Putin were to sort of go back on any agreement, is it then that Trump uses that threat that he now knows is the thing that got Putin to move and everyone else knows got Putin to move? Is it that we're all looking at this the wrong way and saying it's all about military? But actually, is it that Trump then says, right, I now go for it. Those sanctions kick in, those tariffs kick in, because he knows it's the one thing that moves him. And I do wonder if that is in Trump's back pocket that we haven't necessarily considered for him.
And in that sense, we're in the same situation we were in February. The only hope we have, the only hope that Ukraine has, is that Putin overplays his hand and again frustrates Trump to the point where he actually makes good on his threat of sanctions. A huge amount of the economy is invested in this conflict, a huge amount of it. And whilst Putin can afford to go on like this, I'm not entirely sure if you spread secondary sanctions out and followed through on them, whether he would be able to survive in any meaningful amount of time. I think he would probably bank what he's got so far, accept that, and then go and recoup and come and have another go at Ukraine in a few years' time when someone less authoritarian and less prepared to stand up to him is back in power in the White House. But right now, like I say, the talk of sanctions has vanished.
But it feels, just because, I mean, all I would say is just because it's vanished doesn't mean it's not there, because Trump has just come out and done something relatively quickly without warning. There have been things where we've suddenly seen, the theatre in the Oval Office because suddenly he's announcing something. And I do just think the fact that he'd gone that far to be ready to do it, and then, maybe he was just gambling on Putin picking up the phone. We don't know what goes on in his head, but it does make me think that it is the first sign that something happened that was enough. It was enough of a prod for Putin to do something. And now there is a sense of, we know what might move him. And I just think that has changed, for me, the lens by which I see this, because I just think that is now in the back pocket for Trump to then go,
Yeah, but if
that is an America first policy, right? That does fit with Trump's kind of...
Sure, but if Putin's aim is to buy time, so we had a sanctions threat come up that had a deadline, like most sanctions for Trump, that deadline came and when it got extended. Putin then picks up the phone. For months and months and months, we now go down this track again of potential diplomacy. This is all just buying time for Putin to take more land. So at some point, when he's eventually brought to heel, he's acquired more and more and more of the Donbass.
I think Trump's onto that now. And I think there is a deadline for Trump, which is that there's the anniversary of his election and there's the anniversary of him taking over. And it was interesting that he kept talking about the conflicts that he's managed to solve already. And it was, 7 in 7 months was what Caroline Leavitt was saying when she was in the briefing room. And I think there's going to be within the first year, I've done all this. And I think Trump's very big on those anniversaries and dates where he can claim success within a certain period of time. And I just wonder if that is for him part of where he's going to be thinking, I'm giving him this, I'm giving him that. And then I think Trump is someone for whom patience does run out. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it will.
Well, hey, look, if peace rests on one man's vanity, I will take it.
It kind of has already, though, hasn't it? I mean, that's part of the problem, right? That's kind of where we already are. And I think, that is part of where we are at. Well, we certainly are at with Trump. It was very telling that he spent so much of that conversation on Monday talking about how much he'd already done around the world and how great he was and how nothing happened under Biden. It is all about his vanity. But then, let's face it, if that is a massive contributor towards a load of people not being killed, I agree, I'd take it.
Yeah. Right, we've got a few minutes left. I think the good discussion today. We've got asylum hotels to consider. And I'm actually going to read this from Guido Fawkes, because developments even as we are speaking. Richard Tice confirming that Reform UK will be instructing its councils to follow suit after Epping was granted an injunction yesterday afternoon to close the Bell Hotel to asylum seekers. He's been speaking to Times Radio this morning. He was asked if reform-led councils will pursue the same action. Here's the quote: "Yes, absolutely. Our council leaders will be instructing legal departments to pursue all legal avenues after this ruling, which is very significant because it's a temporary injunction based on the fact there has been a material change in use of the building from a hotel, and that's the temporary injunction. So all the Reform councils will be pursuing this. There are 10 of those Reform UK-led councils. Kirsty, the analysis from Politico this morning, Home Office officials and ministers will spend today poring over the implications of this court decision, which blows a hole in government policy. Keir Starmer might be finally trying to enjoy his holiday in Scotland, but the prospect of copycat legal action is another problem for the PM to deal with. Home Office Minister Dan Jarvis has been on the round this morning. I've seen a couple of tweets reflecting that his interview on Times Radio and indeed the Today programme on Radio 4 were car crash interviews. The government's in a bit of a bind on this, it sounds like.
So complacent on the radio this morning. I listened to him on time. So complacent. He was asked, what kind of contingency planning the government was making in the light of this ruling, and he said, if I could just gently point out, there's only been one council that's come forward at the moment. We're talking about 138 migrants in this particular hotel. But I'll just gently point out, Reform councils will all now use this to make a challenge. What remains of Conservative-led councils will almost certainly follow suit. And any areas which are Labour or Liberal Democrat controlled or under no overall control will face the same pressure from their own residents to do exactly the same thing. It is a very British coup. I love the fact that this revolves around, a change of use without that going through the normal planning procedures. This is a disaster for the government. There are 32,000 people housed in these migrant hotels at the moment, right across the country. And if I was a resident unhappy, the first thing I'd be doing this morning is picking up the phone to my council and saying, do the same, challenge, challenge, challenge. So the government absolutely shouldn't be slow on this. It 100% should be looking for contingency planning because in very, very short order, come September, October, they might have a major, major problem on their hands.
The other part of this, Joe, is this issue has dominated the summer recess. This is quite a serious development in the story, but it is just the latest development in the story, in the issue.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a huge problem, and I think the way that the Epping councillors have handled this, I mean, I sort of agree with Kirsty on this. I think it is a very British coup, and it's been done incredibly well. I mean, the joke of the system that you can oppose development in your area, you can oppose a building that is, even quite frankly, someone's sort of major extension to, what they want to do with their house, and an HMO. There's so many things that within the planning system cause headaches for people in terms of for councils, for individuals that are applying, then for councils. But to use this to basically say, actually, local people should have a say on what is going on around buildings that are in their area, and that there should be rules about change of use. It's so basic, and it's bizarre really to think it hasn't happened already. It's bizarre to think that it hasn't happened sooner. I'm sort of dismayed that it's happened after a series of protests and things. I think it's a shame that the narrative is that, well, if you protest, this is the way, this is then what happens. People will be kicked out, and that's the sort of narrative that's being played. But I do think there is something really fundamental about, a building that is primarily to be used for people on a short-term basis, people that are staying a night here, a night there, a week there, or whatever, suddenly becomes someone's effectively residence, is a significant change because it's a significant strain on the local resources as well. And so I actually think all councils will be looking at this. I don't think it matters what colour their leaders of colour rosette, their leaders have stood for election on. I think they will all feel that they need to look into this and will need to see whether there is a case to be made for an injunction in their area. I think the government are completely and woefully underprepared. They knew the timings, they knew that this process was underway. So the idea that they didn't have better lines for the media this morning is pretty poor. And quite frankly, given that Keir Starmer could cut short his holiday and managed to hotfoot it to Washington for talks about what was going on with Ukraine and Russia, I can't believe somebody from the Home Office wasn't able to be out on the media with a better set of lines than Dan Jarvis had today.
I think we can leave it there. Kirsty, what do you think about the dominance of the story? I think is a concluding thought. Is this setting the tone, the atmosphere for the new parliamentary term, which is a couple of weeks away?
Yeah, 100%. And this will determine whether the government can get to grips with the immigration problem that we have in this country, get to grips with controlling our borders, stop the boats, smash the gangs, whatever line you want to use. If it can get to grips with this, it stands a fighting chance at the next election. If it fails to get to grips with this, it will lose to reform. There is no two ways about that. It is the emerging issue. Yes, it's been 2 decades in the making, and it's not all on Labour's watch. But like everything else in life, if you come in, this has been top of most people's priority list alongside the NHS for years and years and years now. We have completely lost control of our borders. Our public services are overwhelmed in areas, not across the piece. We have a housing crisis in this country. Not all of this is the consequence of legal and illegal migration, but some of it is, and that is the reality of that. And the path to any chance for Labour getting re-elected at the next general election is by getting to grips with immigration.
Yeah. Kirsty and Joe, thank you both very much indeed. Good conversation today on important issues. Even though it's recess, nothing quietens down. That is the moral of the story. Thank you for listening to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. Subscribe now on your podcast app completely for free, and you'll get our episodes week by week, where you get the insight of Kirsty and Joe as well. Do keep in touch with us. Email us hello@whitehallsources.com, or you can WhatsApp us on 0333 404 6507. And do us a favour, tell one of your friends, just one of your friends, about the Whitehall Sources podcast and get them involved as well. We'd love to have them here. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you again soon.